The strongest minds don't look the way you'd expect. When most people think about mental strength, they picture someone who never cries, never doubts themselves, never shows any vulnerability whatsoever. Someone who seems almost completely immune to life's difficulties. But here's the truth, that image is almost entirely wrong. The people who are genuinely and deeply mentally strong are often the ones you'd least expect. They don't walk into a room radiating toughness. They don't constantly remind you of everything they've been through. In fact, some of the most mentally resilient people you'll ever encounter are quiet, reflective, and surprisingly comfortable with their own imperfections. And that's precisely what makes them so fascinating from a psychological standpoint. Today, we're going to explore 10 hidden signs that reveal extreme mental strength. Signs that don't look like strength from the outside, but when you truly understand the psychology behind them, you realize they represent some of the most sophisticated emotional and cognitive functioning a human being can ever develop. The first sign is that they are completely comfortable sitting with uncertainty. Think about how most people respond to simply not knowing something. There's an immediate pull toward resolution, checking the phone, seeking reassurance, making a hasty decision just to end the discomfort of not having a clear answer. Psychologists call this the need for cognitive closure. And research shows that most people reach a fairly low tolerance threshold for uncertainty before anxiety begins to surface. Mentally strong people are genuinely different. They've developed what psychologists describe as tolerance of ambiguity, the ability to hold an unanswered question without it emotionally destabilizing them. They can say, "I don't know yet," and genuinely mean it without triggering any kind of spiral. That's not passivity. That's a deeply trained and intentional relationship with the unknown. The second sign is that they feel their emotions fully and then move through them. Here's something interesting that most people fundamentally misunderstand about emotional strength. It's not about suppressing feelings. The brain doesn't actually function that way. When you push an emotion down, the limbic system, the brain's emotional processing center, doesn't simply switch off. It goes underground instead, often resurfacing later as anxiety, irritability, or physical tension. Mentally strong people do something meaningfully different. They allow themselves to fully experience an emotion, observe it almost like a curious and detached witness, and then consciously redirect their attention elsewhere. This process, known in psychology as emotional regulation, involves the prefrontal cortex actively working alongside the amygdala rather than constantly fighting against it. The result is that feelings pass more quickly, not because they were avoided, but because they were genuinely and completely processed. The third sign is that they set boundaries without guilt. This one is quieter than it initially sounds. Mentally strong people don't make a performance out of saying no. They don't over-explain or apologize excessively afterward. They simply communicate clearly what they can and cannot do, and they don't spend days afterward wondering whether they disappointed someone. Research in attachment theory suggests that people who grew up with secure emotional foundations tend to have an easier time with this naturally, but even those who didn't can absolutely develop it over time. The psychological mechanism here involves a stable and consistent sense of identity, a reliable internal answer to the question, who am I and what do I truly value? When that foundation is solid, external disapproval loses much of its former power. The fourth sign is that they don't seek validation for every decision they make. Consider this carefully for a moment. How many times do you share a decision not because you genuinely need advice, but because you need someone to tell you it's okay? That impulse is deeply human. The brain is fundamentally a social organ. It evolved in communities where belonging meant survival, and disapproval felt genuinely dangerous. But mentally strong people have largely internalized their own value system. They still seek feedback when it's genuinely and practically useful, but they've successfully separated the need for information from the need for approval. That distinction, subtle as it sounds, represents a truly significant shift in psychological self-reliance. The fifth sign is that they take full responsibility without self-destruction. Here's a paradox genuinely worth sitting with. Some people never take responsibility for anything, always finding an external explanation, always positioning themselves as the victim of their circumstances. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, some people absorb so much responsibility that every single mistake becomes evidence of their fundamental inadequacy as a person. Mentally strong people live in neither extreme. When they make an error, they acknowledge it clearly, understand what actually happened, make a correction where possible, and then genuinely move forward without looking back. Psychologists refer to this as an internal locus of control paired with self-compassion, a combination that research consistently links to greater resilience, stronger performance, and long-term psychological well-being. Now, here's something genuinely worth pausing on for a moment. As you move through these signs, you might notice that many of them involve a kind of quiet internal work. Not loud declarations of strength, but subtle and deliberate shifts in how a person relates to themselves and to the world surrounding them. That's not accidental at all. Real mental strength almost always lives on the inside, invisible to everyone except the person doing the actual work. The sixth sign is that they can be genuinely and wholeheartedly happy for other people's success. This might seem straightforward, but psychologically it's anything but simple. The brain has a deeply wired comparison mechanism. Researchers call it social comparison theory, where we unconsciously measure our own progress against the people closest to us. When someone in our circle achieves something we also deeply want, it can quietly trigger a low-level threat response in the brain. Mentally strong people have done enough honest internal work that their self-worth is not primarily constructed on being ahead of others. Their identity is rooted firmly in their own values and personal growth trajectory, which means another person's success doesn't have to register as their personal failure. That internal shift is genuinely difficult to develop, and it remains one of the clearest and most reliable signs of deep psychological security. The seventh sign is that they protect their energy without feeling the need to explain themselves. They leave situations that consistently drain them. They limit time with people who regularly destabilize their emotional state. They build rhythms and routines that carefully preserve their mental clarity. And here's what's particularly important. They do all of this quietly, without lengthy justifications or dramatic public announcements. This behavior reflects a sophisticated and earned understanding of what psychologists call cognitive load and emotional bandwidth. The brain has genuinely finite resources for attention, decision-making, and emotional regulation. People who deliberately and consistently protect those resources tend to think more clearly, perform more effectively, and maintain more stable moods across time. The eighth sign is that they embrace discomfort as an unavoidable part of growth. Research from behavioral psychology consistently demonstrates that avoiding discomfort feels better in the short term, but creates significantly more psychological fragility over time. The brain genuinely learns through direct experience. Every time we face something difficult and successfully come through it, the neural pathways associated with coping and resilience grow measurably and meaningfully stronger. Mentally strong people have internalized this truth, often through lived personal experience rather than theory alone. They don't actively seek suffering, but they don't flee from difficulty either. They've developed what psychologist Angela Duckworth famously studied and described as grit, the ability to persist steadily through challenge, because the long-term direction matters far more than short-term comfort. The ninth sign is that they know clearly when to ask for help. Here is perhaps the most counterintuitive sign of all. Many people instinctively associate mental strength with complete self-sufficiency, never needing anyone, handling absolutely everything entirely alone. But genuine psychological resilience actually includes knowing the limits of what you can reasonably process by yourself, and having enough inner security to reach out without it feeling like a personal defeat. Asking for help, when it comes from a grounded and self-aware place rather than a helpless one, is actually a powerful sign of honest self-knowledge. It means you genuinely understand your own needs. You trust others appropriately, and you're not so attached to an image of invulnerability that it gets in the way of actually taking proper care of yourself. And the 10th sign is that they return to themselves after being knocked down. Not immediately, not without real pain, but they return. There's a concept in psychology called psychological recovery, the ability of the nervous system to return to a regulated and stable baseline after significant stress or loss. This capacity isn't something people are simply born possessing. It's carefully built through experience, honest self-reflection, and the slow and steady accumulation of evidence that they have survived genuinely hard things before. Mentally strong people carry a deep and quiet confidence. Not that nothing will ever go wrong, but that when it inevitably does, they will find their way back to themselves. That's not naive optimism. It's something far more grounded and substantial, something genuinely and personally earned through experience. And maybe that's the most important psychological insight to carry forward from all of this. Mental strength isn't a fixed trait that some fortunate people are simply born with and others are not. It's a carefully built collection of patterns, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral, that can be understood, consciously practiced, and gradually developed over time. The fact that you find yourself curious about these patterns right now, that's already a meaningful sign of something genuinely worth paying attention to.